Hello and welcome to another episode of Project Stargate. I'm your host, Mark Brenner, and today we're back with us, guest co-host Greg Ship. Greg, how are you today, sir?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Outstanding. Today we have a very exciting episode. We're going to today on Project Stargate we have the Abduction Files with Kathleen Marden. We just got done reading her book, Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted. And for those of you who are not familiar with Kathleen Marden, she is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, which were involved in one of the most famous and well-known UFO abduction cases in history. She is with the Mutual UFO Network. She works with the experiencers, and she's been on many TV shows and documentaries, including UFO hunters. She has been lecturing and researching, investigating, and authoring books for over 23 years. Greg, this is going to be pretty exciting. We have talked about the Betty and Barney Hill UFO case many times. And this is going to be a very exciting episode. How do you feel about that?
I'm really excited. I love to hear about Kathleen Martin and her views on abduction.
Well, very few people in this field are as qualified as her to bring this information. It's not just the fact that she's not just a researcher, but she's also an experiencer herself. Her aunt and uncle is just part of her experiences. She has um, multi-generational abduction, and usually it goes from person to person, uh,
Mhm,
down the generational family line. But at any
mhm.
rate, without further ado, we are going to bring on Kathleen Marden. Here, let's bring her on real quick.
Hello.
Hello,
Hi.
Kathleen.
Oh, good.
Welcome to Project Stargate. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Outstanding. For start, we just got done. I just got done reading your wonderful book, the Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted, and I was very. I found it fascinating.
Thank
And
you.
it was a very well written book, and I'm going to post a link to order that book on my website for our listeners because I think they're going to agree that this is one of the best books and one of the most foremost authorities on this subject. Um, so, if you don't mind, Kathleen, for a few minutes, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, certainly. Well, I grew up in a family where there were UFO sightings and an alien abduction, more than one actually. My aunt and uncle were Betty and Barney Hill, and I was 13 years old when I heard about UFOs for the first time. Had no idea about it before that, no idea about ET contact, but my aunt and uncle had a close encounter and an abduction in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I did not pursue that immediately. I was there for the conversations in the family, people trying to help them to get more information about what occurred, and even to hear what they recalled under hypnosis. Later on, after Dr. Simon had completed his uh, hypnosis with each of them separately, instilling amnesia at the end of each session. So I had all of that. Then I went to the University of New Hampshire after I graduated from high school, and I studied social work. And that's what I thought I would be. I was studying psychiatric social work. I did an internship at the New Hampshire State Psychiatric Hospital a couple of days a week for a semester. And I graduated from college. And after college, I tried to find a job in social work. I had moved to Cincinnati because my first husband was studying for his doctorate in the philosophy of psychiatry. So we moved there. I started graduate school too, part-time, and I couldn't find a job in the inner city as a psychiatric social worker. So I ended up taking a job as a teacher in the inner city, and I really loved it. So I decided to do my graduate work in education. I taught school for 14 years, and then in about the late 1980s, I would say, I was watching television shows and reading articles in newspapers and magazines about my aunt and uncle that didn't have the ring of truth. And I didn't know if I was remembering incorrectly or if they, there was actually false information being disseminated about them. So I ended up deciding to investigate this myself. So over the next 14 years, 15 years, I did as thorough an investigation as anyone could do. And then I asked Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist and known around the world for his work, if he would join me in writing Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. And he said that he would have to see my materials. He would have to talk to me. So we got together and he spent a few days. He came down spent a few days with my husband and myself. And in the end, he said, yes, he would join me in this book, which I mostly had written. Well, from there, that was published, and Stanton and I found that we worked very well together because he was the physical scientist, the physicist, and I was the social scientist. And our minds worked very much alike. And we got along well together. We enjoyed being together. So we wrote 3 additional books together, and I wrote 2 books without him. And the 2 books without him are books about one of the 2 things I specialize in. I specialize in ET contact, alien abduction. And so with Denise Stoner, I wrote the Alien Abduction Files, sorry.
That's okay.
And then I wrote Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, with 3 other members of my team from the Mutual UFO Network. I was MUFON's Director of Experiencer Research for 10 years, did a major study with MUFON on experiencers of 516. I also worked on the Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation's study of experiencers with over 3,500, and then another one, a smaller one with 75. So lots of research, utilizing that research background, which I was very happy to do. And my team, over a period of 10 years, grew from only 3 people in the beginning to more than 50 people now. And I recently stepped down due to time constraints. And so I've been very busy, but that's kind of an overview of what I have been doing.
Wow, Greg, looks like we're about to sail right into the unknown here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Kathleen Marden is what I consider one of the top 3 experts in this field of paranormal research, along with people like Daryl Sims. She is one of the most foremost authorities and most qualified, I might add, to investigate this stunning field of paranormal research. Kathleen, Greg and I would like for you, if you will, to tell us a little in this first hour, to kind of tell us a little bit about your family's history, going back as far as you can tell, of what's just a general idea of what's happened to your family.
Be happy to. Well, it was September 20th, 1961, and I arrived home from school. I was 13 years old, so I guess I was in the 7th grade. And my mother was on the telephone with my aunt, Betty Hill, and there was concern in my mother's voice. Betty was telling her that she and my uncle had been returning home from their vacation through the White Mountains of New Hampshire the previous evening when a craft had swooped down over their car, forcing them to stop in the middle of the road. My uncle had gotten out of the car and looked up at it through binoculars and stepped away from the car. And when he did, it moved to an adjacent field. He followed it into the field. Now, my uncle was a confirmed skeptic. He did not believe this was even possible, and he continued to attempt to identify it as something conventional, but he couldn't because it was just a circular craft looming in the air above him, no more than 100 feet away. And as he held the binoculars to his eyes and looked up, he saw figures dressed in black, shiny uniforms looking back at him. And as he was watching, all but one moved away from the windows that seemed to encircle the front of the craft, at least the part that he was looking at. And they all moved, except for one, to this panel. And he could see that their arms went up, and he could now see them from the tops of their heads down to about their knees. And when that happened, there were little red lights on like fins that started to slide out from the sides of this craft. People say, what sides? You said an oval. Well, each side of what he was seeing on the oval. And then, or a circle, and then something started to drop down out of the bottom of the craft. And he was looking at the face on the one that was in the window looking down at him. He became terrified. He thought that they had a plan for him, and that was to capture him like, quote, a bug in a net, close quote. And
My
that
God.
that is when he pulled the binoculars away from his eyes so forcefully that he broke the leather strap, ran back to the car screaming to my aunt that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. They started driving down the road. They were on the highway, the major highway at that time in 1961. A larger one has been built since, but so they went speeding down the highway. This was during the off season, so hardly anyone was around. And he told my aunt to roll down the window and look up, because as he was approaching the car, he noticed that the craft was moving in their direction. So she did, and she was expecting to see lights. She didn't see lights. All she saw was blackness. And she and Barney realized later that the craft was directly over the car. She rolled the window up, and within moments, she and Barney heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. And it caused the car to vibrate and for a tingling sensation to pass through their bodies. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway, and they heard a second series of buzzing sounds that seemed to restore their full consciousness. They had a period of missing time in between. They had some memories. They remembered a roadblock. They remembered a fiery orb that seemed to be sitting on the ground. And they remembered finding themselves on a dirt road with tall trees all around. But they didn't know where it occurred or when. They would end up in the fall of 1961 and spring of 1961, going up to that area time and time again to try to find that place. They didn't find it until 1965. But getting back to 1961, Betty said to Barney, "Well, Barney, now do you believe in flying saucers?" And he said, "Oh, Betty, don't be ridiculous. I'll prove to you I can make that sound with this car." So he stopped the car in the middle of the highway. He drove it from one side to the other. He accelerated, he decelerated, and he could not make that sound. So Betty thought that maybe he was kidding. I don't know if he was kidding or not, but he could not reproduce that sound. So they drove home, and they expected that they would arrive home between 2 and 3 in the morning, even allowing for 3 stops that they had made just to look briefly up at this craft. And so they arrived home. It was after 5 o'clock in the morning. They were 2 to 3 hours behind time. And Barney went into the house to use the bathroom. And he went to take his shoes off. And when he did, he noticed that the toes of his shoes were so deeply scraped that he ended up having to buy new shoes. Those were his best dress shoes. Betty went into the house, took her dress off, and noticed that it was torn in several places. At the top of the zipper that ran down the back of her dress, there was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. The stitching was torn out as well around there, and the hemline of her dress was torn down, and on that side, the dress was torn from waist to hemline. So many mysteries, no idea. They knew that something had to have happened. They couldn't account for that time. They couldn't account for these things they were finding. Their watches had stopped and never ran again. And later that day, after Betty spoke with my mother on the phone, she took the advice of a neighbor of ours who was a physicist. He said, if you have a compass, take it out to the trunk or take it out to the car to see how the needle reacts and then get back to me. So she did. She took the compass out and she started on the side of the car, and the needle was fine. It was just normal. She got to the trunk of the car, and that was where she and Barney heard those buzzing sounds the night before, twice. And she saw these shiny circles, all about the size of $50, and she placed the compass over them. They hadn't been there the day before. She placed the compass down over them, and the needle whirled, indicating that there was a strong magnetic field there. So Barney saw it, the neighbors saw it. Within a couple of days, my parents drove my 2 brothers and I down to their house, and we saw some of the evidence. We heard the story from my aunt, while my uncle sat quietly with my father, telling him. My father told us about those entities on that craft that were so threatening to him. He was waiting for another call from Pease Air Force Base, because my father's best friend, who had been the chief of police in Newton, New Hampshire, our neighboring town, told Betty that they should make a report to Pease Air Force Base. Pease had contacted all of the police stations and instructed them if anyone had seen a flying saucer. That was what they called it in those days. They should make the report. So that's what happened.
Wow. If you don't mind me interjecting for just a second, Kathleen.
Not at all.
I want to comment, Greg, and I want to know what you think about this also. it seems to me, when I started investigating the paranormal, because about 16, 17 years ago, because I was starting to have memories of experiences I had throughout my life. And it seems to me, this is one of the first cases I ever looked into. And it seems to me that this case is just brimming with physical evidence.
It is.
Um, it's like, it's undeniable almost. It really is. What do you think, Greg?
I looked into this case, and I think we did this earlier in the show, and I was just really fascinated by the amount of evidence that's been detected in this case. And I think this is something, well, I would consider a legit abduction, in my honest opinion.
I do too. And one thing that I find fascinating, Kathleen, the dress. The dress that was tested, there was some sort of, was it biological residue of some sort on her dress? It's like a pink substance.
Yes, there was a pink substance that grew on her dress after she had put it into her closet, knowing that it had to be repaired. The next time she took it out, there was a pink powdery substance, and she took the dress outside, hung it up on the clothesline. The powder blew away, and she was going to throw the dress away, but then she thought, well, I think I'll keep it just in case it might hold a clue to what happened to us. So she did keep it. It has undergone analysis several times in different laboratories, DNA analysis and chemical analysis. They have discovered that there is something on that dress that was deposited there that did not come from Betty, that is probably a fungus or a yeast. It fluoresces under a black light.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting what that could be. One of the scientists speculated that perhaps the ETs had exposed Betty and Barney too, but Barney's clothes were cleaned at the cleaners immediately after the trip. What this scientist has speculated is that perhaps the dress or Betty, whatever, was sanitized, that all of the bacteria and viruses that might be on that dress were killed. And then fungus or yeast deposited from these extraterrestrial entities onto Betty's dress, and that fungus was also on the floor of the craft. So when Betty's dress was removed, the hem of the dress, the bottom part of the dress, was exposed to this, because not all of the dress has that pink powdery substance on it. It's very saturated around the upper arms where she was escorted. It's also saturated along parts of the zipper where they touched the zipper. Or the cloth, thinking they could simply pull it apart, and broke it. But other parts of the dress around the midsection are just the color blue that it had always been. So that's some speculation. The DNA analysis was fascinating as well. In the most recent DNA analysis, I was up at the University of New Hampshire to do a show with the Travel Channel, and Ben Hansen was the host of that show. So we were examining the dress at the University of New Hampshire in the archival collection I set up for Betty and Barney there, and we looked at the lining of the dress. And Ben used to work for the FBI. He's very, very good at what he does.
You're talking about Ben Hansen from Dateline?
I don't know if he's been on Dateline, but he's been on, Fact or Faked, and he's been on several Travel Channel shows.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. And so he we were looking at the dress, wondering where we might take a sample from the lining, he noticed that there were spots near Betty's navel. Now, I had never noticed that before. I just left it to the scientists who were looking at it. I'm not that kind of scientist, so I didn't want to interfere with anything. But so we decided that we would take a sample of one of those sections that looked like it might be blood from Betty. And the interesting thing is that what she remembered under hypnosis was the examiner produced a very large needle and inserted it into her navel. And so if this was blood or fluid from Betty's body, it would confirm that that was possibly from Betty's navel because of the location and because it didn't saturate the lining of the dress, just, the exterior of the dress, only the lining. And so I did take that sample, I cut it out of the dress, and I sent it to a scientist. And she did a DNA analysis on it. And we had a blood sample from Betty from before she died in 2004. So we had that to compare it to. And although the blood had degraded to the point where she couldn't determine if it was blood anymore or not, both on the blood sample and on the dress, she could determine that it was fluid from Betty's body.
Man, wow.
Yeah,
that's telling. That's very telling. And that definitely correlates with what she said happened as far as the entity sticking that long gauge needle device into her body. And I remember listening to excerpts from both of their hypnosis sections, and I almost felt a little emotional listening to them. I could hear the pain, the fear, and the anxiety in both of their voices.
Yes, absolutely.
It's almost undeniable that something like this happened. Greg, do you have any questions before we proceed further?
No.
Okay.
I do. I have something that I want to share.
Sure. Yes, please.
That?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, another thing that we discovered more recently and didn't have when I wrote the first book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, but I have in the brand new second edition release with new information and a lot more scientific information than we had before, is that Stanton Friedman had written to John Luttrell in the 1970s. And John Luttrell was the newspaper reporter who outed Betty and Barney Hill. It was a violation of confidentiality. They did not want their story made public. They were willing to talk to scientists, to the Air Force. They told the family, but we had to maintain confidentiality. They told close friends and their minister, the couples that they were friendly with at the church, that sort of thing.
Sure.
But what John Luttrell wrote back to Stanton Friedman is that he had interviewed between 12 and 14 people who were in the same location on the night that Betty and Barney had their experience, and that they all observed, and they were separate. There wasn't a group of 12 to 14. There were couples or single people here or there. And they observed the same thing. So we had 12 to 14 witnesses for that night that it happened.
That's
so I think
incredible.
that's extraordinarily important.
I would say so. That's fascinating. Now, as I understand, Kathleen, and this kind of goes, I've discovered this in my many years of research and possibly in my own family. It seems that most of the time that when there's abduction experiences, it seems that most of the time that is in fact a generational curse, for lack of a better term, or something that happens to your, if it happened to you, there's a high likelihood it happened to your mom, your dad, your cousins, maybe your brother, sister, and then your grandparents, and so on and so forth. Can you give us a little bit of background on how that's been in your family?
Yes. Well, what we discovered on the MUFON experiencer survey that I worked on with Dr. Don C. Dundary is that 60% of the abductee group stated that they were aware that other family members had been taken as well. It was 50% among the 516 experiencers. So we had divided them into different groups um, to compare their answers. So yes, it is generational. My mother was an experiencer as well. I'm not certain when this began in my family. My grandmother might have been. My mother, I know, we didn't talk about it, but I do recall a time when I was a teenager and my mother went grocery shopping every Friday night. And she would leave at the same time. She would arrive back at the same time with the groceries for the week, including ice cream and goodies that we liked. So we
Now I'm
were
hungry.
waiting for her. We were waiting for her, anxious for her arrival, and she didn't come. And we waited and waited, and finally we went to bed. Um, my father stayed up, but he was thinking about calling the police because this was very late. And suddenly she drove into the driveway and couldn't understand why my father was so worried. And they started to bring in the groceries, and all of the frozen food was melted. The ice cream was soup.
Right.
So she had no explanation for what had happened. But a few years before that, it was around 1958, I believe, when she was on a weekly grocery shopping trip, she and another aunt were driving past a large field just south of my home and childhood home. And there was a gigantic mothership hovering over the field with smaller craft moving around it. And my mother and my aunt went to a house, and the people who lived in that house went out and saw it too. So there was quite a lot going on there. I do not reveal anyone beyond my generation. Which should be understandable because these are
Absolutely.
our
Right.
offspring and grandchildren and so on and so forth who have bright careers or careers ahead. And we do not want any possible discrimination against them.
Absolutely. People are
Right.
just, I think a lot, one problem with society today is there's just too much closed-mindedness. People are just way too closed-minded. Um, I think as I have a Judeo-Christian background myself, and I think there's a lot more to what the Holy Scriptures say about this stuff than most people understand. And I think that it goes through history. I think there's a lot of proof that this is evidence that suggests that yes, we have been interacted with something other than maybe other than angels and other types of entities. It's pretty fascinating.
I agree. And the furthest I could go back with a confirmation of that is to July 25th, I think it was the 25th, 1952, when UFOs had just been seen and been on radar and were chased by Air Force jets over Washington, D.C. And so Major General John A. Samford called a press conference. It was the largest press conference since the end of World War II. And he began that press conference by stating that these things have been seen in the skies dating back to biblical times, that they've come back over the centuries, and that in the 1800s they were here, and then had been here since 1946 again. And so I thought that that was very interesting. He also added that the only thing that can describe these is phenomena. And then he said, although phenomena is observable, it cannot be studied by science.
Mm.
Wow, that's interesting. So it does seem that for sure that you and your family has had many decades, possibly, of contact and other experiences. I can relate to that in a way. I haven't, I have yet to confirm most of this, but I suspect very strongly, as does someone else who is in this research field, along with you, that I might have had my family line maybe have had experiences. As a matter of fact, when I was reading your book, Extraterrestrial Contact, there was one incident that you were describing when you were after you met with Denise Stoner, for I think a conference or something in Florida, where you had a fiery object that flew in front of your vehicle, and then you felt disoriented and whatnot. I had a very similar experience in my childhood. It's almost verbatim. And for me, it was like an aha moment. Like it was, for me, it was confirmation. It was validation that someone else has experienced something very similar to my own that I can consciously recollect. But I see that you've been, when this book was absolutely phenomenal, and I thank you so much for sending it to me.
You're welcome.
I'm going to read it again a second time, cover to cover, very soon. But anyways, I think that this may be a little bit more common than a lot of people would realize. Greg, what do you think of that?
I think it's interesting. What's interesting, though, is that you mentioned that it's sort of a generational thing. And I think it might be the same way with my family. They have, well, it's not with extraterrestrials, but it's more with ghosts. That's all on my maternal side. It's like every single member of my family's always had an experience with the paranormal, and ring up on the fact that people of every generation tend to have an experience with UFOs. I find is actually it's very fascinating. And
well, I remember that experience that where I was having about 4 years ago, where every night, when I lived in, I was staying with my mom and dad for a little while, living in their home. That lake across the way from their house, I was seeing a UFO every single night, and you saw it yourself, if you recall.
that's right.
That night after you left, I really can't tell you heads or tails of what I was doing the rest of the evening. It's just a blank.
Right.
I do remember having some sort of poltergeist phenomenon happening briefly after that experience. Kathleen, have you seen a lot of stuff like that where people have these close encounters and then experience a type of paranormal fallout before or afterwards?
Absolutely. The two seem to go hand in hand. Orbs have been viewed by 61% of the experiencers that participated in our study. And those are orbs that seem to have intelligence inside the person's home, not just going out and looking at the sky to see one. It was 50% among the abductee group. And then the motion in the mattress, as if something unseen is walking on the mattress. 75% of the abductee group reported this. Only 58% of the experiencers overall, but that's still a pretty high percentage.
Wow, that's
So,
creepy.
yes, and then the other things, a little poltergeist activity, maybe just after it happens that you're taken, or it could be electromagnetic anomalies are quite common immediately after. Denise Stoner and I were able to measure a very high electrical field around the bodies of 5 experiencers very shortly after they were taken.
Wow, that's telling.
I had a question. Kathleen, can you tell me, with people that you've interviewed that have experienced contact with extraterrestrials, do most people tend to have amnesia after encountering it?
Most people have partial amnesia. Very high percentage of experiencers who are taken periodically throughout a lifetime have some memories of seeing light come into their room, of maybe seeing the entities coming into their room, but then they're sort of cut off. A lot of them will remember finding themselves on a table, but then the memories after that are cut off as well. So yes, and in terms of seeing a UFO at 500 feet or less in the distance, 65% of the experiencers and 70% of the abductees have seen that. They've had close encounters with craft.
Interesting.
Wow, the good question, Greg. Thank you. I think this might be a good spot to take a short break. When we come back, though, I want to talk about whatever you want to talk about, Kathleen. This is a gripping conversation we're having. Her book is Extraterrestrial Contact: What to Do When You've Been Abducted. This is the Abduction Files with Kathleen Marden. We'll be right back.